I feel like in the 90s, like everyone's tone was like, pretty scooped, especially with like the Scott Burns death metal stuff. But, in Pantera,
Absolutely.
like it was scooped. And then people in guitar magazines were like, hey, turn your mids up. It works. I feel like it's gone too far the other way and people could be scooping their mids down just a bit because like I hear a lot of really fatiguing, like very heavy in the mid-range guitar tones. And
the other thing is the low end is missing,
Yeah.
Like, back in the day, you used to have a lot more bottom end in guitars, and now because we're using Sims, it's a little bit more pressed, if that makes sense. Like everything is more limited, and like it doesn't have the same bloom. Like when I listen to this mix, I hear the chug and it gets louder and it sounds brutal.
Yeah, and I like that. It verges on a bit dangerous in terms of the mix, in terms of it like, oh, that's a bit. But it sounds heavy, and I think it emulates more of the sound of being at a live show when the guitars are loud and heavy, and when a palm mute chugs live. I don't know. I guess sound engineers might have a multi-band doing that these days, like compressing the low chugs. But I like thick, heavy guitar tones, and again, you don't hear a lot of people doing that. I think people are. Another gripe I have is people are low and high pass filtering too much, and kind of just doing it just because it's just a thing you get told, and they just do it automatically without thinking. But as you'll see, like I'm using Mesa Boogie cabinets, and these ones are all relatively dark in a good way, so I don't need to do any low pass filtering, and I'm going to be boosting all the high end at 10K. And I feel like there's a lot of life up there for guitars, and it brings out some energy and excitement. And if you just like low pass to, I don't know, like 10K or even further than that, you kind of lose the excitement of the guitar tone. They don't sound as lively and heavy. Same with the low end.
It's good philosophy because, again, we've been doing this for so long here. Every once in a while, you see trends, right? Where it's like, let's just say 80% of people that are on Nail the Mix might go in a certain direction or on one thing, and then a different, it's nice to hear somebody come in and just be like, nah, I'm doing it like this and it's different. And again, I think your results speak for themselves, meaning you've got some of the sickest guitars I've heard in a very, very long time on a modern recording. So I'm over here taking notes.
Oh, thank you. That means a lot. Yeah, I mean, something that you see a lot of is people kind of high passing their guitars like all the way to like 100 or maybe even higher up. And the problem I find with that is the only low end that's left is the really muddy area. So your ear gets drawn to that. Whereas if you go a little bit less than that, but then maybe you just carve a bit out, but you leave some of the more subbier low end in, I feel like that's more of a pleasing approach to me, and it kind of tackles like the problem area as opposed to just like, oh, that's low end, let's kill it.
Do you have a thought on high pass filters versus low shelving? Because that's something I've personally gotten into. And again, I don't really mix bands like this. I'm more of an active rock guy, but I've been low shelving a lot instead of high passing and leaving that information in. And I've been getting really gnarly low end, like in my rock mixes, and different types of movements that haven't heard in a long time in a lot of people's mixes. And I've enjoyed it. So I always wonder if anybody else is experiencing this at all.
I haven't done that, but I think I have a similar mentality in that I just don't necessarily high pass as much, or I'll do quite a soft one. So it's not like just aggressively just killing everything in one place. And sometimes like I've got it on there, but it's like, it'll be back here. It's not really going to be doing anything really.
Filter.
It really just depends on the source tone as well. Like the same goes for everything, especially like I think the way I EQ'd the natural snare, like the moves I'm going to make on this snare do not apply to other snares that I've worked on. I've done I will be doing some aggressive cutting at a certain point. And same goes for guitars, like depending on the cabinet you're using, especially, you're going to need a different approach. But I might try out just doing a low shelf, because there's nothing to be afraid of with low end on guitars. Oh, I mean, also it does make sense. Like a lot of modern bands are using 7 strings and 8 strings. I prefer to work in higher tunings. My favorite guitar tones usually exist somewhere between D and C. I feel like you get some of the low end and it feels thick and heavy, but it's still tight and mean enough to be a guitar tone that I find exciting to listen to. I feel once you go lower than B, although it's heavy, just for my personal taste, I don't hear many low tunings. I'm like, oh, that tone's something I want to emulate, because it starts to not resemble a guitar tone that
Yeah,
I
it's
like
just
anyway.
upper harmonics. You know, you're missing those fundamentals, and the chug bottom end bloom of the cabinet is so low that either a real speaker cab is going to have a hard time even like representing that frequency information. But
Yeah,
I don't know.
there's something punchier about higher tunings that hit you in a different way, and they're not necessarily less heavy.
What do you guys tune to? Like, what is this in?
So we've always been in E standard, but this record,
Really?
actually, sorry, the last record was D standard, but this one we went down to C sharp, like Testament the Gathering. So
Yeah.
I think C sharp standard is like the sweet spot for me. It's still, when you play like thrashy stuff, it doesn't sound like a different genre, because when you start to down tune it just and play the same riffs, it all of a sudden becomes melodic death metal. So like depending on your tuning, like your genre changes. So I think we can still have the thrashy elements in C sharp standard, but just feel a lot heavier and chuggier and stuff. And it suits my vocal. So,
Well, respect for standard. I mean, that's something you don't hear every day. It's always cool, like to see a unique approach when everybody's going one direction. Like, nah, man, I've done a couple records in standard, and it's like, what? It's so awesome.
Yeah, it was like a knee-jerk reaction to everyone. Like when I think we switched tunings in 2007, and it was like metalcore and deathcore, and we were like, we're just going to go this way. And admittedly, it made it harder for ourselves because we just kind of ended up on our own path, and there wasn't necessarily like a genre we fit in with at the time. But it definitely made us stand out, especially guitarists, because like, oh wow, E standard. It was a talking point. Admittedly, I would have liked to have changed tuning and gone back to being down tuned sooner, but just felt like we had made a name for ourselves as the band that didn't down tune, so I kind of stuck with it.
Respect. That's all I can say. I respect that very highly. You said that modern metal tones are missing the good bottom end and have too much mids. Any other observations or tips that could be helpful for modern metal guitarists that down tune a lot?
It's a tough one because the more you down tune, the less low end you want and more mid range you need to get the notes to cut through. But admittedly, when I was in Architects, we would tune down, it would be C sharp standard, but the low string would go down to a G sharp, and sometimes it would go down to an F sharp. So the low two strings would be an octave apart. And it's essentially like an 8-string tuning. But the way I set up guitars for Architects wasn't any difference. And I also pre-mixed all the guitars on the last 2 records anyway, before Zach Savini mixed them. I'm not saying that he then didn't process them. I actually don't know, but I heard his URM podcast where he said that I was quite particular about the guitar tone, so I don't think he touched them too much. So anyway, my point being is that Architects tune very low, and my approach to getting tones with Architects is not actually any difference as it is for Sylosis. Like I still look for a bit more high end and a bit more low end than I do mid range, and realistically, there's not a lot of difference. But it really depends on the mix. It depends on the tuning as well. Like, so if you're lower than B, you know, some of these moves I'm doing, it might be a bit different, and you kind of just have to sacrifice that thickness because it's going to be coming from your bass guitar and it's going to be in a different area on the actual guitars. My approach generally, though, for just getting tones like this is not saturating them. There's on the Korn F plugin, which I think I had on the preamp guitars, there's like a tape emulation thing that you can turn on, and although it's really pleasing and it softens out any of the harsh whistles, it kind of just turns them woolly. It's not a bad sound, but it really depends on the aesthetic of the band and what you're going for. And for me, that sort of like razor sharp edge is lost by turning that on. So that is, if we look at the back end of the plugin, that's emulating like a warm round tube inspired saturation, and there's some other options for that. Sounds great, but just in terms of the aesthetic that I'm going for, I don't use saturation on my guitars. I try and just do everything with EQ and that multi-band compressor.
What do you think about Soothe for helping remove high-end whistles? Do you have any views on that?
Yeah, so I know a few people have been using that recently. Chris Clancy, who does his own stuff, but also Colin Richardson's assistant these days. Pretty sure he's been using it on guitars. I think Nolly's been using it on guitars. And I like rate those guys very highly. But all my favorite guitar tones didn't have Soothe on because it wasn't around 20 years ago or something. So I try and avoid using it on my guitars just to see how good I can get the tone. Just, yeah, try and get the source tone nailed and just minimal moves or broad strokes with EQ. But I have tried it and it does work. But it can, as we all know with Soothe, it can be easy to overdo that. So yeah, go carefully. I have used it and I just use it between that like 2 to 5K in particular. So like if I was going to use it, I'd do. I'd say that's a healthy amount. I think, if you're particularly working with something where you really want a prominent vocal, or you've got like a singer singing and you want a bit more of a clear vocal, like taking out anything harsh from the guitars, high end with Soothe is a good thing, but I don't personally use it.
Soothe is a very powerful but dangerous tool. Sometimes I feel like it can really homogenize people's mixes and make everything kind of sound the samey. And that's something artistically that I absolutely try to avoid at all costs. So.
Yeah. And also with metal, even though like my approach for this mix is definitely slightly more of a cleaner thing than some modern mixes would do, if you just kill every harsh frequency from everything, you need some of that for metal to sound a bit dangerous and a bit harsh. Like I've always found like 3.2K like horrible on guitars until I looked at this guitar tone that I liked the other day. I just like opened up Pro Q3 and just looked at it in the session. I was like, oh, it's literally just a spike at 3K, and I thought that tone was amazing. So sometimes leaving in the harsh frequencies, be it on cymbals or guitars, adds to aggression. So you don't want to just like nullify or neuter or just take the life out of your mix, because metal is supposed to be aggressive, and sometimes the harsh frequencies add to that.
Yeah, metal's not supposed to be nice. It's like the whole point of metal is to get people edgy and irritated and pissed off and like want to mosh and work out and run and bench press, and you know what I mean? And like when we make our metal mixes sound too nice and polished, I think what happens is I don't know, like go listen to Cannibal Corpse. Maybe I'm getting old, but like Tomb of the Mutilated, like that guitar tone I would never go for a guitar tone like that in a million years, but it sounds so brutal. And it just makes me mad every time I hear it and pissed. And there's just an energy that they captured. And again, now that would never be tolerated in modern music because it's just too edgy, too aggressive, too bright, too hissy, too whistly. But yeah, it sounds pissed.